So my name's Dr. Neil Lee, and I'm an Associate Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics. So my main research interests, I'm focused on the idea of inclusive growth. And what I'm interested in is not just the causes of local economic development, but the consequences as well. So who gains from processes of economic development and why? So this involves me looking at labour markets, it involves me looking at cities, and it involves me looking particularly at things like innovation and the tech sector, which are driving the economy. So I tend to use quantitative methods. So before I joined a geography department, I was in an economics department, and a lot of my research will use econometric methodologies. So we tend to take a big panel of cities, so a big number of cities over a long time period, and look at, for example, what happens if you grow your high-tech industry in this city? What does that mean for people who are on lower incomes or relatively disadvantaged groups? Those are the sort of questions I'm interested in. And the best way of sort of focusing on these or answering these questions is really to use econometrics. But what I'm interested in is most of the time we tend to look at an average effect. So we say, right, if you grow a high-tech economy in your city, on average people gain. And I'm interested in decomposing that average effect. Which groups gain and why? So, well, I've just finished a load of work for the British, which was actually commissioned by a British think tank, where we looked at what happens in the UK labour market. And, you know, labour markets in different countries are very different. But in the UK, one of the things we've seen is lots of jobs growth at the bottom of the labour market. So this is jobs in restaurants, bars, cleaners, security guards, not particularly well-paid jobs. In my research in the UK, what we've shown is that in cities where they've experienced strong growth in the high-tech economy, so this is cities like Oxford, but you can these results hold for the United States, so it might be sort of places like San Francisco. What you see is a lot of growth in jobs at the top, but this changes the labour market for people at the lower end of the labour market, because it's not efficient to have a manufacturing job in a city like London. So what instead you see is this change in the number of jobs, and the jobs are often in these low-skilled, non-tradable jobs. Now, the problem here is that these jobs, they're often poorly paid, and there's often very little chance of progression. So what my research shows is that if you do grow your high-tech economy, this is a good thing, right? If you attract Airbus to a city, this is a good thing on average because it creates jobs, but there's a catch, and the catch is that those jobs are not particularly good. So policymakers really need to think about the consequences of this. Yeah, so in the UK we have had a very famous referendum recently because we had the Brexit referendum. And actually one of the things I don't look at whether tech drives has affected Brexit, but we do know a few things about Brexit, and a lot of my research is focused on the Brexit vote. And one of my favourite papers I've written recently was we looked at what happens to people who live in their town of birth. So this is for most of us who are academics. We don't live where we were born. We move around the world. We move around the country, and this really isn't the experience for most people. Most people live where they're from, where they were born. And actually what we showed in this research was that people like this, they were 7% more likely to vote for Brexit. So you're more likely to vote for Brexit, but only if you'd had large-scale in-migration into your local area, or if your local area had experienced economic decline. So one of the findings of my research was that these processes of economic change, which have meant that there's been growth in the cities in the UK, these have meant that people who are living particularly in small towns and peripheral areas where the economy has declined, this is one of the factors which has been driving the Brexit vote. So, well, first of all, we would always recommend a local approach, right? In that much of what we're talking about, the phenomenon I would focus on, these things are very different in different places. So it's very different being a relatively low-income person in London or San Francisco or Paris where costs are very high. It's very different being in those shoes than it is being a low-income person somewhere which is much cheaper. So you need a sort of policy mix which is appropriate to the place. But I'd say there's two things policymakers need to be focused on. The first is that you need some sort of balanced strategy. What you can't have is just a strategy for a place which only focuses on high tech. You have to, or innovation, or the entrepreneurship. What you need to be doing is thinking about, if this strategy comes off, what does that mean for the rest of the local economy? And how can you work to make sure that the distributional benefits are relatively even, or make sure that people gain? So that's the first approach. The second approach is I think we need to think about what happens in the low-skilled labour market, and that there are a lot of, in the UK we call them, these are sometimes called the division between Mac jobs and MUC jobs. So Mac jobs being jobs you do on an Apple Macintosh computer, and MUC jobs being jobs you do in McDonald's. And this is a bit unfair because actually jobs in McDonald's aren't that bad. But the idea here is that we need to be thinking more about, we think a lot about the Mac jobs. We think a lot about people with their MacBooks. We don't think nearly so much about the MUC jobs. We don't think about what happens in the lower skilled labour market. And there's loads of things policymakers could be doing if they cared. So in the UK, we've tried a higher minimum wage, great instrument of policy, really hasn't affected employment in that part of the economy at all. But you can also think about things like more cooperatives. This is like a northern Spain type story. Or you could have skills ladders. So in New York, one of the things they're doing is they're focusing on making sure if you do go into a job which is not particularly high skilled, how can we make sure people in that job get better at what they're doing, improve their productivity so the employers will pay them more. So there's lots of policy implications. The problem is that we tend to just think about the sort of high-skilled, sexy end of the labour market with the high-tech workers. We don't tend to think about the consequences for people at the bottom. So there's two main theories about what would happen to technological change in the labour market. So one theory says, right, what's going to happen is all of the jobs, like low-skilled and mid-skilled jobs are going to go, right? Or particularly low-skilled jobs, because computers or machines are going to replace people doing these tasks. But then there's a more nuanced position, which is that actually the jobs which will go will be the ones in the middle. So it'll be the jobs which are doing skilled but routinizable jobs. Okay. So bookkeepers, secretaries. It used to be that academics had secretaries, now we have email. So in the UK, the fastest declining job in over the 2000s in the UK was secretarial work, because we just don't need secretaries anymore. So you've seen an upgrading in the skill structure, but then at the same time, as people have needed, as we've seen an upgrading in the skill structure, we've seen people do jobs which are reliant on jobs which cannot be automated, which are not skilled in that you need a qualification to do them, but which are rely on some sort of manual dexterity or being there, or you can't automate them. So being a security guard, waiting on tables, things like that. I mean, you can't really automate these, or we haven't worked out a way of doing it very well now. Now there's a catch here for economic geographers. There's a catch. So we've seen growth at a bit of growth at the top, growth at the bottom, decline of mid-skilled jobs. Now there's two problems here. First is that it makes it harder if you're doing a low-skilled job. It used to be you could go and work in a factory in a low-skilled job. You could find your way into a mid-skilled job. That route is closed, right? Because there's no way you can get up to you can't go from being a security guard to being a banker. And the second catch is that these low-skilled jobs need to be done close to the people doing high-skilled jobs. And this is important for economic geography. Because if you have a city like Toulouse, where you have Airbus, you have lots of high-skilled jobs, there will be a sort of relatively buoyant labour market for people doing low-skilled jobs. Similarly in somewhere like London. But then think about it if we're looking at a peripheral place in France, where there's relatively few high-skilled jobs, or a part of South Wales in the UK, where you have relatively few skilled jobs. Now the problem is, if you don't have those skilled jobs, then you have fewer people doing those sort of jobs at the bottom. And that's why you end up with sort of high levels of unemployment in some of these regions. And actually you can see that. So skilled workers, people with degrees, certainly in the UK, certainly in the United States, they tend to be employed wherever they are. You know, because people move, there's sorting effects, and there's lots of jobs which skilled people can do. Low skilled workers, there's much greater variation in unemployment rates across the country. So it matters much more whether you're a low skilled worker in a successful town like Oxford, where I'm from, than if you're a low skilled worker in somewhere like Hull in the northeast of England, which is a less economically successful town. So actually, this is again a sort of argument for why you should have sort of geographically tailored economic development strategies.